Get more out of life every day. Picture biting into a whole peeled orange. Not a timid bite, but a huge wide-mouthed bite. What if you lived your life like that? Living Life Juicy is what that life might be like. We explore how we can be present and kind as we do great things. Welcome to the Living Life Juicy channel. My name is John Losey. I'm your guide as we try to explore how to be present and kind as we go about doing great things. And today I'm honored to have an old friend who we haven't talked in quite a while. So there's going to be some catching up going on in this conversation. But Allen Hilton is the founder and executive director of A House United. And he holds a PhD in New Testament from Yale. His former faculty there. He also has a background in Christian formation. He held positions in 3 different churches there. But now he and his foundation are addressing the divide that we're experiencing in this country. And to me, there's nothing juicier. You know, my definition of juicy is that you live abundant and a little bit messy. And this is dealing with the messiness. And that's why this is a juicy conversation. So, Allen, welcome. I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks, John. Me too. It's been a while, so it's great to catch up.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what's going on in your world right now?
Yeah. So my family and I live in Austin, Texas, because my wife is an executive at the University of Texas Law School. She raises money for them and sort of minds their alumni. She is awesome. Her name is Liz. My boys are 16 and 14, so they're ensconced in high school living. And
golf, right?
And golf, that's right. Never let that not be mentioned. And then I just need an airport because I do most of my work around the nation. I'm starting to build a base. We've been here 2 years, starting to build a base in Austin and work with a few churches here and a couple other organizations. But a lot of my work is far flung, so I just hop on an airplane and go.
Cool.
Yeah.
And most of that time is spent on House United stuff?
Yes. So my day job is House United, and it's a lot of good work, and I'll get back to talking about what it is. And then Liz and I have this sort of cool side hustle of health coaching, where we help people get to a life with their body and mind and spirit that they care about and want to have. And so we do that on the side. It's something we can do together. It's the first time we've ever been in ministry together on this little side thing. So we love that too.
That brings up a great question, is the connection between individual wholeness and how it impacts whether or not we, impacts how we divide each other. Do you see a connection between that? Because I'll use my word for it, is what you're talking about. The health stuff is trying to take a wholeness approach of saying you can't stand alone if you're neglecting your physicality or any aspect of the whole you. It throws things out of balance. Do you think that impacts how people are interacting?
I do, and it's a vice versa also. There's this interaction because there were a lot of pieces during the 16 election season and the 17 aftermath in which people did research on blood pressure levels in the United States and heart rates, and they were going up because of the tensions around polarization, right? So on the one hand, polarization is bad for health, right? And on the other hand, this is a very cool thing. People in the United States disagree vehemently on health care plans and health care policy, but they all agree on health. They all want it, right? And so there's this, and this is kind of moving back to the center of your question, because people can, if they embrace health, they can actually find other people and join them whom they never would have joined if they hadn't found this common ground, right? It becomes common ground that starts to become before the things they used to disagree and separate about, right? It's not that politics goes away, it's that they find something that they agree on that is important.
Yeah, it seems like there's this huge divide between, and I saw somebody make this distinction before, access to healthcare versus healthcare.
Yeah.
And that's, people immediately go to that divide of the access question, and they skip over the place where there's agreement.
Right. And even in personal health seeking, which, you know, you'd put it in the preventative category more than in the treatment category. Even in that, people who aspire to be healthy and actually go for it often find one another, and they like one another's sweat, and then they find out they disagree and they're already sweating, so they keep going. And so I think there is, anywhere that I can help people find any common ground, that's great. But to do it, as you say, in a place that is going to make life juicier or more robust is double good. So yeah, that's I call it a side hustle. We get to do it together, and it fits House United for the reasons I just talked about.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about common ground. I'd like to hear a little bit more of how you define the divide that we find ourselves in. How do you define the issues we face as a nation that keep us so divided?
Yeah. So a lot of people are bewildered by the fact that they can't keep friends they used to have, and that they can't talk to family at a family reunion, and they can't have Thanksgiving dinner, and all of those things that are very personal. I was on a train from Princeton to Boston because I had a 3-day intensive at Princeton Seminary, and then I was doing a weekend intensive with a church in Wellesley. And I was just already wrung out after the Princeton thing. So I'm sitting on a train trying not to engage with the person next to me. In fact, I chose her because she had her head in a book. So I sat down and I got my Kindle out and I was completely signaling, I don't want to talk, right? And within 30 seconds, she said, "So what do you do for a living?" Right? And we went on to this great conversation because she lived in Baltimore going home to parents, but she's a lefty from Boston, and she and her husband have these great friends who are righties outside Baltimore. Then Trump gets elected and they can't even have coffee, right? They completely lose any friendship moorings. And I see that kind of thing happening all the time. And the sociologists tell us that the thing that primarily identifies most Americans has become, rather than race or religion or region, has become politics. And so when politics become a central part of who I am, right? If people are defining by politics, when politics become a central part of who I am, suddenly it's no longer just a disagreement on an issue. When you disagree with me, you disagree with me, right? Not just what I said. And so it's very personal for people. And when that happens, people find safe tribes, because if their person and personality are at risk, they're going to gravitate to the people who are going to say yes to them. And so a lot of the work I do is about not making politics less important to people. That may happen, and that would be an okay thing, but to rebuild their courage to not put their person at stake in it, right? I'm going to go in and risk this because I know that I'm a person separately from my issues, right? Separately from my convictions. I read a lot of, just kind of squaring with your question, I read a lot of the current tribal situation in those terms. It's just an escalated part of our identity. And so Christian voices and other voices have to get in and say, no, you are you, and your views are your views. They're important to you, but you aren't being attacked when somebody attacks your views, right?
Yeah, and it's an interesting way to frame it up, talking about primary identity in your political affiliation versus, I hear a lot of friends talking about the intersectionality between sexuality, race, all that stuff. Yep. And they're claiming their identity as Black or homosexual or, bi or whatever it is. And right. Yet their identity is what you're suggesting is that may be part of it, but the political activist side of it is becoming more of the identity than what they're claiming their identity is. And the same thing goes on the right too. Yep. People who have been doing amazing things in the name of economic development and, outside of small government in order to make big impact personally, those type of things. That identity is getting subjugated to the politics of it.
Yeah. And I think when that happens, there's a great voice from the point of view of discipleship. There's a great voice to get back to sort of community and this is within the church. We'll talk about how it might spill over, and you and I both have convictions about that, right? How the church might become a vehicle for God's healing of the world in this area. But in the church, if we can move community, Jesus prayed in John 17 that his disciples and those who would believe through their words may all be one, just as God the Father and God the Son are one, right? May they be one so that the world may know that you sent me, Jesus prays, right? And so if Jesus, in his last words before going to be tried and crucified, if Jesus raised Christian community and unity to a level of occupying his last words, then maybe we ought to question the ascendancy of orthodoxy. Maybe we may ought to kind of invert the value of community and orthodoxy that we've historically. Orthodoxy's been up here, and we've tossed out heretics, and we do, all those things. And community's been down here. We're glad to get rid of people if they disagree with us, right? I think at least putting them on a parity and making a tension out of that is a Christian thing to do, and especially right now, to question that sort of hierarchy is really important for moving forward as disciples together, right?
And I do want to get, I know that your book, and I'm going to hold it up here,
Nice.
the subtitle is How the Church Can Save the World.
Right.
And my question for you is, and I want to get into this later, I want to explore the history first, but what does this say to the people who are not part of, a lot of people immediately go, church equals religion.
Right.
The people who aren't part of these communities and may not even buy into the teachings of Christ. What I want to explore later on, what does this have to say to those people? But before we do, I want to hear your take on how we got here. Yeah. How did, what's a bit of the history that led to where we're at today?
So when the division and tribalism and polarization started to happen, psychologists, social psychologists, moral psychologists, evolutionary psychologists, all kinds of people started to ask, how did this happen? And so they traced it back to human history. And in that survival mode, at some point in history, we think survival of the fittest, and immediately our mind goes to really strong beings who could survive in the pack and move on. But there came a point in human history when a group would triumph in finding food and protecting the food in all those ways over the individual, no matter how superhuman the individual was, because the individual had to carry everything on his back. The group, they could kind of delineate labor, right? A couple people to mind the food, a couple people to go foraging, maybe somebody else just kind of broadly keeping an eye out. And groupishness ended up surviving over superhuman individual. And
it's interesting you bring that up, because if you talk to the brain physiologists, they would suggest the limbic system developed so that in groups we could anticipate the behaviors and the feelings of others, and that role of empathy and survival became crucial because we switched over to the group work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the downside of that, of course, is that when I define my group, there is a not me group or not our group, and the inside or outside dynamic came along with groupishness, because we're competing with other individuals, or we're competing with other groups. And I put in the book a study done at Sheffield University where they put babies up in front of screens, right? And they newborn babies, they had them look at a screen and see a Caucasian face, an Arab face, an African face, and an Asian face in succession. They put them up for a while, take them down, put them up for, put one after another. And the babies, newborns, didn't linger any longer on one face than the other, right? They're trying to ask, are we born racist? Are we born with racial preference or not? And it turned out we weren't born with racial preference. The kids lingered on each face just indiscriminately, right? Within 3 months, the infants favored the facial type of their caregiver, their primary caregiver, right? So we aren't born with a racial preference, but we are born with equipment to identify who's safe very quickly, right?
Yeah. Well, and safety, that piece, again, back to, did some work in emotional intelligence, which led to the brain physiology stuff.
Right.
It's, right now we weren't the biggest, baddest creatures on the savannah when we developed our emotional, the limbic system and empathy, the need for that stuff.
Right.
But the fight, flight, or faint, some people say, developed in that for survival mechanism. And when we're able to, the next step was being able to take control over our emotional impulses through our prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
Problem is, we still do fight or flight when we feel threatened. In the boardroom, I work a lot with the business people. And so that instinct for survival kicks in, and it actually is counterproductive. So now we either, opt out or we get aggressive in a situation where we need to let our prefrontal cortex get our best thinking in.
Yeah. Yeah. And that describes what we see in American culture right now, right? If I am with somebody who disagrees with me on an issue that has any value to me, I immediately go into fight or flight, and I hammer or I retreat, right? And if I hammer, I then retreat back into my people. And so if we're built that way, if we're built groupish and in-group, out-group, and we know quickly how to identify who's safe or not, that doesn't mean we've been polarized forever. It means that we've had groupishness forever. But in the last 40 years, the combination of media, social media, becoming more and more, it's become more and more available for me to simply get my news or my information from people who agree with me. And as that happens, the natural groupishness goes on steroids, right? And suddenly my people are defined and I'm only hearing from them. So I can fathom the other side less and less, and we spiral away. And I think that's when the violence comes, because we stop. I mean, the big outcome that is troubling and that makes a lot of people predict a civil war within 10, 15 years, a second civil war. The big outcome is we get to the point where we think the world would be better without them, right? And when that happens, all kinds of terrible things happen.
Yeah. You mentioned 40 years ago. Tell me what happened 40 years ago that you think really escalated this.
Yeah. So the 60s and 70s, leading up to 1980, were, famously hippie, and some people, when I talk to them and say this is the most polarized we've been since the Civil War, which sociologists say, they say, but what about the 60s? There were bombings, there were all those things. The numbers didn't get that high, but there were these outbreaks, right? In the 80s, something really crucial changed. And that was what used to be network news, everybody watches it, and network television, everybody watches it, suddenly becomes niche market television and niche market news. And so when that happens, first on radio, Rush Limbaugh, and then eventually progressive radio shock people. When that happens and people can start hearing the same mantra every day, and people aren't gathered in front of Walter Cronkite or the evening news together, they're gathered in front of their news. That's a huge, huge change, right?
So they're not working off the same information. They're not working off of common ground.
Right. There's no shared cultural literacy, right? People would go away from Walter Cronkite and disagree, but they were working with the same set of data, right?
Right.
Now everybody's got their own data, and it becomes possible to build alternative truth worlds, right? And so if that's the problem, if the problem is we've become tribal and defined ourselves primarily as political, the question then becomes, how does God save the world through the church? How does God save the world generally? And so is this a good time to do that? Is this a good time to transition? So the title of the subtitle is audacious, but Jesus had it in John 17, right? He said, when these guys become one, it's going to change the world's view of God, right? That the world may know that you sent me and that you love them even as you love me, right? That's Jesus's. This unity is towards something that happens in the world. So when you and I think of mission, we think of people going to Guatemala or Africa or Asia, or we think of either mission internationally or mission to people who need in our cities and culture. Jesus thought of Christian unity as a mission, right? And nobody has ever gotten that. I've never seen a church organized around that. Unity in the church or any kind of community building goes to the fellowship committee, right? What if it were in the mission committee? What if it were, we've got to be one so that when the world sees our face, they see a different God. And that we haven't done that well. Religion, Christianity are notorious for dividing people, and for wars and for inquisitions and for crusades. What if we flip that, not only in Christianity, but in religion generally? What if religion became a cohesive force in American and world culture rather than a driver of this separation? And that's the experiment of the book. And it's also kind of the premise for House United, this work I do around the world. That I go to churches, but I go to churches because God wants to do something through churches to mend the world, right? Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And that's the question that I want to explore some with you is, I love the questioning of even the concept of mission. So when I work with organizations, I go in and nobody has a shared definition of mission, vision, purpose, objectives, goals. Right. Everybody's using the same words, but talking about something different, and coming back and saying, what if we could rescue the word mission to mean the thing that you're trying to get done?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden missions doesn't mean foreign or even inner city or rural, whatever, catastrophe relief. Those are missions in the sense that you're trying to do something specific.
Right.
And what I hear in you is saying, well, let's add to that, one of the missions of the church as put forth by Christ is unity. And maybe the primary mission of the church is they will know us by our love.
Right.
How do we take that, and does that translate outside of specifically Christian religion, but any kind of, I'll use the word theology, but it applies to any kind of tribe, I guess. Yeah. The theology of your tribe, can that be switched to unity?
Yeah, so it goes against the grain of the natural coding that we talked about earlier, right? We've got in us, Toni Morrison wrote Paradise. Toni Morrison, of blessed memory, just died, Nobel Prize-winning novelist, wrote a novel called Paradise. And for that, when she researched, she said, okay, I've read every view of the afterlife, epic and non-epic, that I could get my hands on, cross-cultural, Western, non-Western. And there are a lot of different things that go on, but three things they have in common, right? One is community, one is eternity, and the third is exclusion, right? You and me together forever without them. And she's talking about a deep coding. If we put it even in our most sacred picture of the afterlife, then it's somewhere deep in us. So anytime any organization says we're going to be about unity, they've immediately gone against the grain of something deep in human makeup, right? But I think when Jesus prays for it, he doesn't pray for it thinking it'll never happen, right? I mean,
right.
It's so I think what the order that I've tried to follow is, we know that Christians are called to unity. We know we've been bad at it, but we know we're called to it, both by Jesus's prayer and by all those other passages. I hear there are divisions among you, says Paul in 1 Corinthians 1. One is for Paul, one is for Apollos, one is for Cephas, even one is for Christ. In the meal and in the Lord's Supper, they're divided. Some are coming and getting fed up and drunk, and others aren't getting any food. All through 1 Corinthians are all of these enjoinders by Paul or exhortations. You need to come together. You need to be a team, a unified whole. So it's not just Jesus who's praying this. It is a string that runs through, right? If that call is a mandate, at least to Christians, the book and what I do is about, well, let's start with the church. Let's hope that God's going to answer Jesus's prayer through the church, right? And what would that look like? And then we move to, okay, once we get good at it, then we've got a skill the world needs. And so I go to interfaith conferences and teach, and I say, well, okay, Christians aren't good at this yet, but we're trying to get better at it. How about if you rabbis and you imams talk to your opposite number within Judaism and Islam? So rabbi, if you're a progressive rabbi, get together with a conservative synagogue and figure out how you guys do a mission project together. Same with Islam. Have them operate across the left-right line in their own space. Make it a value to come together, right? As their form of brothers and sisters or co-religionists, right? And then roll out to the world and say, you know what, you're not making as much money because your work teams are polarized, right? Somebody voted for Hillary, somebody voted for Trump, and they can't function at the water cooler. Or the people who trend toward being more traditional and conservative as an orientation are thinking that the risky ones, the more progressive ones, are completely out of line, and vice versa. And you've run into this, right? Corporate teams can have those same fault lines, even if it's not about what healthcare or abortion should be, the issues that we most fight about. There are just tensions between ways of doing the world. Well, if you can go into an organization like that and say, you're going to make more money if you figure out how to work together, right? You've done this a lot. And so I start with the church and then try to roll it out into the kind of enlightened self-interest of the world, right? Your life will be juicier in John Losey terms. Your life will be juicier, more abundant. Your bottom line will be better. Your community will be more whole. You'll be able to eat Thanksgiving dinners with your family, all those things. If you just get some new skills for engaging across different.
Well, and I think it part of that goes back to our choicefulness. And this is where I think the brain science and some of Paul's stuff, I think, again, correct my theology, but the idea that when they say you are no longer a slave to your old nature, your old person, but you can be different, the executive functioning can override the encoding that we have for groupishness.
Yep.
Because we can think longer term and we can choose differently. We would still have the impulse, but when it shifts into your executive function, all of a sudden you can make decisions based on different things other than your emotions.
Right.
And there's an old phrase that says it's not about stimulus response, it's about stimulus pause response. And in that pause is where we might be able to find the fruit or the juiciness of delayed gratification, of looking past winning and moving towards solving.
Yeah. So if we have our eyes on the prize of the benefits of community, it's funny, the stimulus and then pause, in the health coaching team that I talked about, stop, challenge, choose, right? Is the triad that does exactly that. And we believe that it can work with other temptations, right? We know that it can. In fact, I've thought about calling House United Polarisers Anonymous, right? We know that there are transformation systems that when you get yourself in a community that is all devoted to changing one temptation, right? To addressing it or living against that temptation in a different way, right? Conquest can happen and victory can happen. We know that, but with this one, people are kind of resigned to it just staying. And so the work that you and I and others are trying to do is to give them hope. No, polarization isn't inevitable. 50 years ago, people weren't worried about their kids marrying the opposite political tribe. Now, half the nation is worried that their kids are going to marry the opposite political tribe. Well, that's a reversible habit. And that's what temptation minding is, right? It's reversing a habit in the hands of God. And So I'm optimistic, guardedly so, right? But because we've seen other kinds of transformation, right?
Yeah, and so it's interesting you brought up the whole what do you call Polarisers Anonymous?
Yeah.
Because when I first started in coaching, especially around emotional intelligence and choicefulness, one of my clients came up to me and said, "You know what? This is a lot like a 12-step program because you don't just decide once. I have to get up every day and decide to be present so I can get the stuff I want done." So every morning he chooses to push his decision-making past the limbic system and into his conscious decisions.
Yep.
And so that got me thinking, man, a lot of what I do when I'm either coaching or consulting is that waking up every day and deciding.
Right.
And that gets, so I don't know if you've ever heard of challenge coins from the military or things like that.
Yeah.
They're really big in businesses now too. So I combine the concept of the chips from the 12-step programs and the challenge coins that are all about identity. And so I have these these chips. I call them coin chips. And the idea is that these identify people. The white chip, as I understand it in the 12-step program, is about intention and wanting to change. Mm-hmm. And it's not about your commitment to the program. It's about the program's commitment to you. And this is an object lesson of, I have this so that I look at it and it reminds me to choose my intention for the day.
Right. Right. Yeah, I love that. I love any tangible markers of progress in this enterprise, right? And it takes different forms in different venues or different parts of our work. I want to get just for a second to the blocking and tackling here, because we've stayed mostly on the conceptual level, but what the book doesn't get to, the book tells great stories about a gay affirming church in Dallas and a Southern Baptist, very conservative fundamentalist church in Houston accidentally ending up in the same mission work along the Mexican border. And once they get there, they're building and painting houses for people who need to learn, and they find out who each other is. And instead of running back and saying, "I'm sorry, we don't do anything with people like you," they've already started to get somewhere. And the vehicle for that, in the book, I tell that glorious story, but the vehicle for that is what I call Christian Mingle, which is any way that I can, that's a dating site, right? Someday I'll get sued by them for using the term. But any way that I can get people doing something they would both do separately, people who are very different from one another, get them doing a common enterprise that they would both do if they didn't know each other. I'll do that. And that's I'll bring people together to do something they agree on, and then have them sort the stuff they disagree on, and just agree to disagree a lot. But contact, because one of the fallacies of our current way of doing the world is people think I can outshout them, right? All we need to do is win. And they end up calling their opposition evil or stupid. And it's clear they don't know their opposition. It's clear they've never met an evangelical, or they've never met a far left progressive. And they talk about them in objective terms, and they defame them. And then they imagine that they're going to win this argument, right? I've never been persuaded by somebody who hated me, called me evil or stupid, right? And so Christian Mingle is about getting people in contact so they can make headway on the other stuff, right? The more common coinage of House United is, I do courageous conversations, and a lot of people call a lot of things courageous conversation, racial conversation, sexual conversations, all those things. In my world, it's taking the things that divide us most ideologically and asking those hard questions in a room filled with people, and having them learn how they can talk to one another civilly and respectfully and sort of lovingly. The mantra is, we're going to leave the room loving one another more than when we came, right? And we're going to take out healthcare, we're going to take out immigration, we're going to take out gun control, we're going to take out abortion, we're going to take out those topics, and we're going to address them as a group, and we're going to leave loving one another more. And lo and behold, it does it. It happens over and over, because they're learning skills for listening long enough to hear a human instead of a talking head, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what I do in churches and in schools and in organizations around the nation most often. They want to do these courageous conversations and figure out how they can listen better and how they can stay together even when they differ on significant things. And
it sounds really similar to some stuff I do for organizations where it's not that there's this really animosity and polarization. It's just the company's going down the tubes because they don't have a shared outcome. They don't have they haven't defined why they're there, and therefore they can't. Trust is built on knowing that we're all pointing towards the same direction. We're all trying to get the same outcome, at least when it comes to organizational trust.
Yeah.
And if you don't share that, then it doesn't matter if you like each other, you don't like each other. It's not going to happen. Right. But I love the fact of pointing, like the two churches building, was it the schoolhouses on the border?
Yep.
They agreed on mission.
Yep.
That's right. Then it really didn't matter that they had differing opinions on other stuff. They trusted that they were both trying to get the same thing done. Yep. And then they could work.
Right. Right. And I think they agreed on the value of those Mexican children, right? In that case, and this was the 90s. I don't know what this would look like in the sort of current immigration situation and how Christians left and right are addressing one another on that. It's getting pretty ugly. But in those times, both of those churches were able to fully sign on for, we value these people enough to stay, even though it's going to be hard to stay and navigate the differences with our work partners, right? And I think that happens in each of the courageous conversations that I do. I think people want to be a part of the solution rather than part of the problem, and they don't want to have enemies in their town anymore. And even if it's hard work, if Allen's going to help us, or if somebody's going to help us and kind of take us by the hand and give us room to fail, right? We're going to give this a try. And it turns out that in place after place, it becomes their largest adult ed program, right? Because people flock to these things because they want to make steps forward in this part of human life, in this part of Christian life and American life. And so courageous conversations are taking off, and I help churches sort of after I leave figure out, okay, how are they going to keep leading these? How are they going to keep doing them? In the book, I just told stories about 2 or 3 instances of them, but churches want help in actually how do we block and tackle, right? And that's what I do a lot of the time.
Yeah, and so you set it up. We wanted to get everybody in there, deal with the tough stuff, and walk out loving each other more. Right. What does that actually look like? How do you get that done in an evening?
So I write a prep guide. I've got maybe 15, 20 of them on different issues. And in that prep guide, I present a balanced set of arguments and data that try to get to, my friend Adam Hamilton is a pastor of Resurrection United Methodist in Kansas City, largest United Methodist church in the nation, 20,000 members in 3 or 4 campuses. When he preaches politics of any kind, he tries to make everybody in the room aware that he understands their position, right? These prep guys, so he doesn't come from one side and make anybody feel like, oh, I don't even know you're in the room, much less respect what you believe. That's what we try to do with House United Courageous Conversations. Put data on the table for why somebody could sensibly believe this, right? And why somebody could sensibly believe it's opposite. So it can be history, it can be Bible, right? There are a lot of things in Bible where the conversation is continued within Scripture, right? We should have kings, we should not have kings. Somebody could have edited that out over time, right? Somebody could have said, we're only going to accept the people who wanted to have kings or the people who didn't want to have kings. The Bible didn't ever get edited that way, right? They kept these very contentious issues alive. Paul and James, right? Not contradictory, but they're awfully scrapey with one another.
Yeah.
Why don't you just leave James out of the Bible? Well, that's not how it works, right? So it's a big tent Bible. I bring that big tentishness to the prep guides. So before they enter the room, and especially those who wanted to get ahead of the game, have seen, okay, I believe this strongly, but I can also a little bit understand why those other people believe that. And then I intro in that way when I do one. In the actual conversation, the first 10 or 15 comments, everybody in the room after each comment says, listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church. And it doesn't say listen to what the Spirit is saying to the church, because you can hear almost anything in a room like that. You've got to be the active listener who's saying, is that God's voice? But I've got to be listening as if God may be speaking.
It's
and
interesting.
that's from a barroom brawl, right?
It's distinction of listening to versus listening for.
Right.
That's just a powerful one. Two little words that are essential.
Yeah.
And so the very first step that I hear you saying is that both sides need to feel heard and understood before they can engage with each other.
Yeah. Well, and they need to have been invited into the room in a way that says, we need your voice. Because often when people try this kind of work in churches or in public square, the majority voice is organizing the event, and the majority voice has the facilitator, right? So if it's a majority progressive crowd, it's going to be really hard to get conservatives into the room, right? My job in setting the table is to go out of my way to invite the minority position into the room and say, not only will we welcome you, we need you, or this isn't going to work, right? And I've been in conservative majority churches where I have to practically hold the hands of the progressives, but I've been in progressive majority churches where I have to coax the conservatives. And frankly, on the progressives have a hard time picturing a conservative being meek or feeling intimidated, right? It's a stereotype thing, but they are often. I've had conservatives crying after a courageous conversation because they didn't feel like people in the room were respecting them. So yeah, it's partly setting the table by these prep guides, partly in the room, making it clear that each person here is a child of God, and we need to listen as if the word of God is coming from them, and then make our assessment as it comes out, right? And so it changes the attitudes in the room. Suddenly, if I have to say that annoying phrase, listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church, 15 times, eventually I'm going to realize, I'm listening differently than when I do it at a bar or when I do it in my family or, whatever. So we're trying to recast how this kind of thing goes.
It creates that pause.
Yeah.
So what comes next? Now you've set it up, you've got all the voices in the room, and they're starting to feel valued and heard, and they're listening for the Spirit,
right? And
also listening to each other. What's next?
So what generally happens, John, and it's very funny, is the first one, they think that I most want everybody to be really nice. And so they are very gentle and won't tread closely to conflict, and they kind of shy, partly because people don't know how to talk about politics and religion, right? But partly because they think what I want from them is this sort of gentility and soft kindness, when actually I want them to bring their conflict into full array and then figure out how to operate within it, right? So the first one is usually pretty innocuous. They feel good when they leave because they've talked about healthcare and they didn't kill one another, right? But the second one, I make a stronger case for, no, you guys want to argue about this. You want to get your opinion out there, and you want to get your conviction in play. So do that. And then let's learn how to love one another. And so it takes 2 or 3 before they actually start to think, okay, if I make a mistake here, people are still going to love me. Allen's still going to love me. Whoever is facilitating is still going to love me. And then they take the gloves out and gloves off, and it's awkward a little bit, right? Because they make mistakes. They haven't been trained yet. But you can't really train them until they go to that extreme, right? Until they go to, I can't believe you said that. And then say, oh no, and figure out how to do it. There's a prologue to Hamilton written by the Roots, the people who are on Jimmy Fallon's, the hip hop group that's on Jimmy Fallon's show, that pictures the scene where the founding fathers are signing the Declaration of Independence, and it's John Trumbull did the art piece, and it's a famous one. You've probably seen it, where everybody is standing with their hands behind their back and looking very kind to one another and genteel. But the song goes, you ever see You ever see the painting by John Trumbull, founding fathers in a line looking all humble, patiently waiting to sign a declaration, become a new nation? Not a single grumble. The reality is messier and richer, kid. The reality is not a pretty picture, kid. Every cabinet meeting is a full-on rumble. What I'm showing you, what you're about to see is no John Trumbull. And it's Jefferson and Hamilton, top of their lungs, shouting at one another, but they stay at the table, right? What we end up with is the American experiment.
Right.
What churches need is to actually trust one another, that they can make mistakes, that they can get a little chippy with one another, and they'll learn how to do it better. That's the next step with Courageous Conversations, is to actually get some sparks in the room.
And again, working outside of the church part,
yep.
I think one of the worst things that's happened is the phrase conflict resolution, because the idea is, let's bring it to an artificial close, whether it's resolved or not. And to me, the skill is about conflict management.
Yeah.
You don't want to resolve a conflict that's not resolved yet.
Right.
But how do you manage the energy in the room to get that great outcome? Yeah. And the willingness to be messy. When I training, go back to camp, and that's where Allen and I first met, working at a camp 35 years ago. And at camp, as I trained counselors, they'd come to me and go, man, things are just going horrible. It's Wednesday and there's all kinds of conflict. The kids are fighting. And I learned to say, you're right on the verge of something spectacular.
Yep.
Because they're learning how to be real with each other. And if you go into group process, before a group is actually performing, that storm needs to happen, because that's when all the stuff gets worked out and they learn how to be with one another.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's how, by the way, that's how the Constitution came. And that's how the early church figured out Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. That's how people get to better things, right? Is staying at the table when they're in conflict and building something better because of the difficult work that it is to have conflict, right? So I completely agree with you on how the dynamics go, that you almost have to get to the heat before the good stuff happens, right?
You gotta, it goes back to, you gotta go through the desert to get to the promised land. You have to die in order to be resurrected. Yeah. You've got to, that's, the theme around Juicy is that you've got to be willing to get messy if you want to get to the good stuff.
Yep. And that's full overlap with the vision of Courageous Conversations and overall of House United. I don't want everybody to end up in some sort of converged purple, right? I want there to be blue and red and different shades, bringing their variety of gifts, 1 Corinthians 12, bringing their variety of gifts, and all of them for the common good, right? 12:7. And so I don't need people to be like one another. We get worse if everybody's like one another. Yeah. I need people to be able to manage their difference. And that's when the church takes off, right? That's when
not just manage the difference, value the difference as covering up my blind spots. If we all are looking in the same direction, then we have a big field of view that we're not seeing.
Yep. And to move metaphors to Paul's one, if we're all elbows, we can't get a lot done. Right? If we're all ears, we can't get a lot done. When the body of Christ is really working, we're all fulfilling our function and trusting that the other people will fulfill theirs. And that difference may chafe us. We may like our particular eeriness, right? Or our nosiness, right? But the fact that there are feet to propel us to the next place, we grudgingly say that's great, right? And so valuing those differences and figuring out how to manage whatever tension arises because of them is a better way of manage the conflict stuff.
So, I'm sorry.
You go.
I was going to say, if somebody wanted to join the movement,
yep.
Or the, what did you call it? The Dividers Anonymous, or
Polarisers Anonymous.
If somebody, what 2 or 3 things could an individual do to start to at least acknowledge and move a direction closer to each other? What's a couple of things that individuals could do?
So one of the drills I do with people when I go into an organization is we really aren't very good at listening. We don't do it very much, and so it needs actual muscle building. And even even having people sit down for 20 minutes across from one another and just listen to the other person's story. I usually take it to some kind of difference or some kind of important issue or something, but even if they just have to listen 20 minutes to the person's biography,
Why they prefer Kansas City barbecue over Texas,
or Red Sox over Yankees, or right. The excruciating and exhausting piece of watching them do 20 minutes of listening without intervening. They can ask clarifying questions, but then I have them flip roles and have the other person tell and the first teller listen. And then I put them in a group and have them introduce one another in the first person. So you know how if I'm saying, John's a good guy, he lives in Newbury Park, he does this juicy stuff, it's awesome and all that, it's a lot different affect than if I say, my name is John Losey. I was born in Southern California. I worked a lot of years at Forest Home, and God was doing excellent. Do you see what I mean? When I have to engage your views, your reality in the first person, it's completely changed, and I have to understand you in a way that I didn't before. So having them listen, knowing they're going to need to do that, is kind of a big deal, and especially if they're listening about conflict, right, or about something they disagree on. And so I've heard stories of Somali immigrants and refugees in North Dakota, and North Dakota farmers and oil people being brought into a room by an outside organization and having to do that exercise. Right? There's social unrest. There's some crime breaking out. There's some one of them's bringing new legislation to the state legislature saying we need to get rid of the immigrant population here. You know, all those things. And they're sitting in a room, and now you've got a black Somalian talking in the first person about having grown up in North Dakota, where my family had been for 4 generations. And you've got a white North Dakota farmer saying, I was born in a poor part of Somalia, and my dad was just getting a business going when the whole nation blew up. So we came to the United States, and I hope to, that's when you got a guy in a farming hat who, who's chewing snuff or has chewing tobacco in, telling the story of the black Somalian in the first person. There's not a dry eye in the room, right? That kind of listening exercise, when it can be done in a group, you can present in that way. When it can't, just find somebody and listen for 20 minutes and tell them, would you listen to me for 20 minutes? It's amazingly effective, right? So that's one. Letter writing, I have people write letters across cultures. Find a pen pal in Alabama if you're from New England, or in New England if you're from Alabama. Anything that makes me put myself in another person's skin. Watch the opposite news, right? If I'm a Fox News person, I got to watch MSNBC for 2 weeks and really try to be able to say at the end of that time why somebody would believe this stuff, right? Vice versa. That kind of thing, that life swap is a place to start for anybody who's even just sitting at home trying to figure out what are we going to do about this.
It sounds hard. And so working with developing people, it's all about helping them step outside their comfort zone. And one of the things I know is that rarely do we do that on purpose. It's usually we see the edge of our comfort zone in the rearview mirror. Right. How can we create an environment where people find themselves outside their comfort zone around these things?
Yeah, I think we have to raise the value of this as a Christian virtue, right? In church work. Outside, we have to raise this as a value of a more perfect union, or whatever level of humanity we're appealing to, and whatever motivates the people we're talking to. Pascal said that good Christian apologetics or defense has a couple stages. Make good people wish it were true, and then show that it is, right? And in this realm, what I find is it doesn't take a whole lot to make people wish this could be, right? the high school coach takes the team to the state championships to watch so that next year they'll want it more, right? And I think when we can portray a future that is juicier, right, that is more robust and has community minding itself well and growing and flourishing, the work that it takes to get there becomes easier. Not easy, but I'm more willing to leave my comfort zone for something out there that is going to be better than I am just because the pastor told me to, or my boss told me to, or my coach told me to, right? My overall answer is we've got to find the proper incentives. If I want to run a marathon, I've got to run shorter distances first, and we have in every other part of our life that dynamic that says, if I want this, I have to do these things, even though they're hard, right? This is another one of those.
Yeah, and I would suggest that it's not that it gets easier, it's just that it gets more valued.
Right.
I'm surrounded by practitioners who promise to make it easier and promise to make it automatically happen.
Yep.
And to me, it's not about making it easier. It's that all of a sudden the person says, you know what? It's important.
Yeah.
And the outcome is totally worth the effort.
Right.
It's just hard to get people people won't change until they see that the change will be more valuable than being static.
Right. And another way that gets stated is, if my current discomfort outweighs the difficulty of getting to the goal. And I think you see that in your work, and I certainly see it in mine. We begin every introduction I do to a courageous conversation starts with, guys, this is really hard. If we do this actually, it's really hard, but here's what's out there for us if we do it, right? And so I think you're right. It raises the value on what I'm doing because of what it is becoming, what I'm becoming because of it. Yeah.
So I want to kind of wrap things up with a few kind of more rapid fire questions. And
yeah, sure.
I won't hold you. You're not signing your life away in ink when you make an answer here.
Yeah.
I just want kind of some first responses.
Right.
So we'll start off with an easy one. Like, who would you say is your hero?
Whoa. I can't choose Jesus or Paul, I'm sure.
Yeah, I would say, assumed.
Yeah. Well, I have different ones in different realms. I'll just fire them off. I've taken to Lin-Manuel Miranda, the guy who wrote Hamilton, because he's figured out how to change a whole way of doing things, musicals. He's figured out how to do that and not completely become an enemy of the whole industry, right? And I think innovation and people who figure out innovation and bring it into play are huge heroes for me, especially if they can do it in some consonance with the system rather than revolution and overthrow. So that's a big deal. The Jonathan Haidt is an author and a professor who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, and he is trying to bring viewpoint diversity back into universities. Right? He's a New York University professor. The Righteous Mind, its subtitle is Why Good People Disagree on Politics and Religion, right? And so some of the stuff I mentioned as of how we got here is Jonathan Haidt stuff. He's a hero for me because from the academic world, he decided, I'm going to try to help what's becoming a big leftward tilt, and I'm going to do it as a lefty. Right? He became a centrist, but he started out as a lefty. I'm going to do this because it'll make things better, right? And he's taken a lot of hits, and so he's another one who's trying to bring change and do it in a way that actually invites people rather than taking the place over, right? And I guess that's who my near heroes are these days, because that's kind of what I'm setting out to do a little bit. Make change without completely blowing the place up.
Yeah, it's about solving rather than winning.
Yeah. Bringing people together for a common good, right?
So, tell me this: other than your own books, what gifts have you given? What books have you given most as gifts, or just given away?
Oh yeah, Sebastian Junger was an embedded reporter who wrote a book called Tribe, and it's on the re-entry into American culture of people who have been in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a brilliant book, and it's very slim. It's easily readable. The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt is another that I give away often. In another realm, I'm an Anglophile and a British mystery guy, so I give away a lot of those sort of 19th century history mysteries because I think it's a decent thing right now to look at other times when social structures were working together a little better than our current time. But that's an excuse for, I think you'll like this mystery. So I give away, for fun reading, I give away British mysteries, but for advancement for people, Tribe and The Righteous Mind are the two I give away most. Todd Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains, I give away often too. It's a helpful one to me.
Yeah, that one, I read a lot of the leadership management, all that kind of stuff. That's one of the best I've read in the last 10 years.
It's great. Yeah, it's great. And we happen to be friends with him, which helps.
Yeah, it does. It goes back to Forest Home Camp when we were all a little bit more knuckleheadish.
That's right. And we haven't fully escaped that.
Yeah. Okay. Totally off different subject. I want to learn a little bit about what do you use? Are there any apps or technology or stuff that you use that help you out a lot? What kind of, what's your favorite app or your favorite technology?
Yeah. I use Zoom a lot, right? Because last year I was gone 42 weekends somewhere in the nation at a church somewhere, right? And midweeks were to businesses or colleges or universities, but I don't want to travel that much. So I'm doing more coaching by Zoom. I'm doing more webinar-ish things. I'm teaching a Monday night Bible study this year, 37 weeks through the Bible, that I'll do on Zoom. So Zoom is by far my go-to for being able to communicate across space. I'm not an app maximizer, I think. I use the fantasy football apps,
of course.
But I think that, these aren't profound. I use Kindle a lot because I read on planes, but
I wasn't looking for profound. I was looking for real.
Yeah. So yeah, I use Zoom and I use Kindle most of all.
Well, I love the fact that you're expanding your influence through Zoom. Obviously I'm a fan of in-person, because you can get the read so much better.
Right.
But man, if my second choice is video conferencing for the visual, and you get a chance to see where people are at on that.
Right. Yeah. So those two mostly.
Yeah. So Allen, thank you so much for giving of your time on this. And man, I feel like we've just hit on a very surface level some really, really important things. So I encourage people, if you want to get a little bit deeper into the whys behind this and a few tactical things, check out A House United. And it's not, I would say, while it's written to the church, there are important insights in here, even if you feel like you're outside the church, important insights if you want people to come together. If, like so many people are expressing, that they feel ill about the state that we're in, both left and right. I have friends who express how disappointed and actually like fearful and to the point of physical illness about where we're at. Well, here's some steps to take to do something about that. Right. So thank you so much for being here.
It's so great to be with you, John, and Godspeed as you move forward with all of your different kinds of work. And I will look forward to our next conversation. Yeah. Thanks, brother.